The snow had been falling for 3 hours when the last of her trunks was set outside. Not inside the carriage, outside it, in the yard, where the hired coachman stood hunched under his box and refused to make eye contact with anyone. Vivian, Duchess of Aldermore, watched from the top step of the hall as 2 footmen she had known for 4 years carried the second trunk past her without speaking. They did not look at her either. She had spent the morning understanding that this was how it worked. The Dowager Duchess Constance had spoken, and Aldermore Hall had simply rearranged itself around the new truth she had declared, the way a room rearranges itself around the absence of a fire. You only notice when the cold has already arrived. Constance herself stood at the drawing-room door. She did not come outside. There was no cruelty in standing inside. The snow was falling, and she was an elderly woman with a bad knee. She simply stood, hands folded at her waist, and watched the yard being cleared of Vivian's belongings, with the particular stillness of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and is now done being patient. "You will be comfortable at the Hawthorne Inn," Constance said, her voice carrying through the cold with no difficulty. "I am told it is adequate for a lady traveling alone. The coachman has the address." Vivian did not say what she might have said. She had been composing the sentences for 2 weeks, ever since the Dowager had first called her into the library and explained, in the gentlest of tones, that the marriage had been conducted without proper notice of the family, that certain documents were missing, that the late Duke had been in a fragile state when the register had been signed, that it would be better for everyone, and she had laid particular weight on everyone, if Vivian were to remove herself quietly to another situation, while the matter was reviewed by the appropriate ecclesiastical authorities. She was 27 years old. Her husband of 14 months had been dead for 3 of them, and she was being told by his mother that she had perhaps never truly been his wife. She descended the steps. She did not take the footman's offered hand, because the footman had looked through her when offering it, and she would not reward the gesture. She climbed into the hired carriage herself, settled her skirts, and looked once more at Aldermore Hall. At the long, pale facade she had loved, from the first morning she had woken inside it. At the grey stone, against the white sky. She was never truly his Duchess. That was what Constance had said to Lady Dorothea Merritt the week before, in the small drawing-room, where they had thought no one was listening. A young housemaid had told the housekeeper, Agnes, and Agnes had told Vivian with the grim care of someone delivering a wound she cannot prevent and cannot pretend not to see. Vivian said nothing. The carriage moved, the snow came down, and Aldermore Hall disappeared into the white and the grey, and she watched it go until there was nothing left to watch, and then she turned her face forward, and she kept it there. Her name before she had become the Duchess of Aldermore was Vivian Harcourt, and she had been the 3rd daughter of a clergyman of modest means and extensive learning. Her father had given her languages and mathematics, and a clear eye for what things were actually made of rather than what they were dressed to resemble. She had not been beautiful in the way the season noticed. She had been intelligent in the way that made certain men uncomfortable, and others suddenly, quietly attentive. Aldermore had been one of the latter. She had met Charles V, Duke of Aldermore, at a wet afternoon gathering at her cousin's house in Somerset, where he had arrived 3 days early due to a misread letter, and she had been the only person in the household who had not treated the inconvenience as a calamity. She had given him a cup of tea, a chair by the better window, and a candid opinion on the road conditions between Somerset and Bath, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man recognizing something he had not expected to find. They had been married 7 months later. He was 43, and she was 25, and he was the best man she had ever known, patient and deliberate and unfashionably kind, and she had loved him without ceremony or performance, the way one loves a thing one did not know one needed until it was present. He had been ill before the wedding, not concealed ill, not desperately ill, but carrying something in his lungs that the good weather helped and the London season did not. She had known. She had married him, knowing. She had not married him for Aldermore, or for the title, or for the life. She had married him for the particular quality of his attention and for the fact that he asked her opinion about things and then actually listened to the answer. He had died in December quietly, in the room at the south-facing window he preferred. She had been beside him. She had held his hand until it was no longer necessary to hold it. His mother had arrived from Bath the following week. Constance, the Dowager Duchess, had been civil during the first month. Correct. She had managed the household with an efficiency that left Vivian slightly outside every necessary conversation, consulted on nothing, informed of decisions already made. The second month had brought the first inquiries about the marriage documents. The third month had brought the library meeting, the quiet voice, the suggestion of the ecclesiastical review, and the name of the Hawthorne Inn. The hall had begun rearranging itself while Vivian was still living inside it. Furniture she associated with her own use migrated toward rooms she did not occupy. The housekeeper, Agnes, who had been warm, became carefully neutral in public and communicated her loyalty only in small, invisible acts. A fire kept burning 10 minutes longer, a tray with an extra cup. The rival had been invited to dine twice in 1 week. Her presence was not threatening in the way Constance intended it. Dorothea was a thoughtful young woman who appeared somewhat bewildered by her own positioning. It was the invitation itself that was the message, the assurance to all of Aldermore's county neighbors that a suitable future was already being arranged, that the current inconvenience was temporary. The casting out had come on a Tuesday in January, and the snow had cooperated with the theatrical wait of a snowfall that had been waiting for precisely this cue. The Hawthorne Inn was in the market town of Fenwick Cross, 2 days north of Aldermore, which was a sufficient distance to be invisible but not so remote as to be entirely inaccessible. It was an old inn with low ceilings, and a landlord named Mr. Furrion. Brockett, who was suspicious of ladies traveling alone and sympathetic, once he understood that the lady in question paid her bills on the first of every month without fail, and caused no disruptions whatsoever. Vivian had 3 months of money. She spent the first 2 weeks learning what was available in Fenwick Cross, and the third week arranging to provide some of it. The magistrate was Mr. Bide. Hadley Fenn, a widower with 2 daughters of 9 and 13, who were clever and insufficiently challenged by the woman he paid to teach them. Vivian presented herself at his door on a Wednesday morning with a letter of introduction from her father's bishop and an honest account of her situation that did not ask for sympathy and did not withhold material facts. Mr. Fenn had looked at her for a long moment with the particular assessment of a man whose professional life was the reading of testimony, and who had learned to distinguish a true account from a shaped one. He had hired her the following Monday. The girls were named Patience and Cecily, and they were hungry for mathematics in a way that made Vivian think of her own childhood, that particular appetite that no one around you quite understands. She taught them. She marked their work with care. She corrected Patience's multiplication and extended Cecily's natural philosophy past the point the previous teacher had considered appropriate for a girl of 13. She did not perform gratitude to Mr. Fenn. She did work that made his daughters better, and that was the contract between them. And it held. February passed. March began. The second week of March brought a traveling wool merchant to the Hawthorne Inn, who had lately been in London, and who had attended a card party where he had overheard a conversation between 2 ladies of quality, discussing the ecclesiastical petition the Dowager Duchess of Aldermore had filed in regard to her late son's marriage. The merchant did not know Vivienne. He told the story at supper because it was interesting, and Vivienne sat 2 tables away and heard every word. She was never truly his duchess, said one of the ladies at the card party, according to the merchant, repeating what the dowager herself had been saying through the winter. The merchants at the other tables expressed mild interest and returned to their mutton. Vivienne set down her fork and looked at the middle distance for a long moment, and then picked it up again and finished her supper, because she was hungry, and because she had learned that one could receive bad news and still require food, and that eating was not a performance of indifference, but a function of continuing to exist until circumstances changed. She allowed herself, in the privacy of her room afterward, to sit on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and feel the weight of it. The petition was filed. The ecclesiastical court would hear arguments. Without the documents, without the register, Without someone of sufficient standing to testify to the validity of the ceremony, she might lose even the name. She might become Vivian Harcourt again. As if the 14 months had been a dream she had no right to. She pressed her thumb against the ring finger of her right hand, where the late Duke's seal ring was sewn into the lining of her traveling cloak, hidden there on the morning of the casting out, while she was still in her room and the footmen were making noise in the corridor. She had not shown it to Constance. She did not know, precisely, why she had hidden it, rather than surrendering it when the dowager had asked, except that it had been pressed into her hand on the morning of the wedding day by Charles himself, privately, before the ceremony, with the instruction that this was his own seal, and she was to carry it with that understanding. She understood. She had sewn it into the lining of her cloak, and she still had it, and no one knew. In London, at the same week, Vivian was calculating how much longer her funds would hold. Edmund Ravensleigh was reading a document that had taken him 3 months to locate. He was the Secretary of State for Home Affairs, though his actual function for the Crown was somewhat wider, and considerably quieter than the title suggested. He had known Charles, the late Duke, for 11 years, and he had liked him with the particular affection one develops for a man who is fundamentally honest in a world that punishes honesty, unless one has sufficient rank to absorb the punishment. Charles had been honest with everyone, including his mother, which had made the relationship painful, and the mother determined. Edmund had watched the winter's campaign with a cold fury that he did not show to anyone, because he was a man who had learned to be useful, rather than emotional, and fury, without strategy, was merely noise. He had begun in January to assemble documentation. The marriage register had not disappeared. It had been moved from the Aldermore Parish Church to a secondary register in the care of the County Ecclesiastical Office, where the Dowager Solicitor had presumed it would be found only by the court she herself had engaged. What the solicitor had not considered was that Edmund had friends in county ecclesiastical offices across 3 counties, and that those friends answered correspondence with a reliability that most people in London found quaint. The register arrived by sealed post on the 14th of March. Edmund looked at it for some time before setting it down. He looked at the window. He opened his desk drawer and removed a small oval miniature in a tarnished silver frame, the portrait of a woman with dark eyes, who had died 3 years ago, in the early hours of a morning he had spent on Crown business 50 miles from home. He set the miniature on the desk and looked at that for a moment too, with the particular expression of a man who has learned to carry guilt the way one carries a stone in a coat pocket, always there, occasionally turned. He had been too late for Eleanor. He had known it at the time, choosing the Crown's business over the journey home, and he had been wrong, and she had been buried before he arrived, and he had not been given the chance to correct it. He was, he thought, looking at the marriage register, not going to be too late for this. He put the miniature away, took up his pen, and wrote to the Crown. It was a Thursday morning in late March when Edmund arrived in Fenwick Cross, traveling without ceremony, which meant a carriage without arms and 2 footmen, who dressed in plain coats and asked no questions. He had come on the pretext of a boundary dispute that required a justice of the peace's opinion, which was not entirely pretext since the dispute existed, and which gave him reason to call on Mr. Hadley Fenn without explanation. Mr. Fenn received him in the morning room. They dealt with the boundary matter in 20 minutes. Edmund had one more question, which he delivered with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned that the phrasing of a question predetermines its answer. "You have a woman in your employment at present," he said, "a gentlewoman. I understand she is teaching your daughters." Mr. Fenn looked at him steadily. "I do. She is." "I wonder," Edmund said, "whether I might see the schoolroom." Mr. Fenn, who had read men for 30 years, said simply, "I will show you to the window." The schoolroom was at the back of the house, across a small courtyard visible from the corridor window. Through the glass, Edmund could see a plainly dressed woman of middling height seated at a table with 2 girls, one of whom was working something out on paper, while the other appeared to be arguing with a figure on the board. The woman listened to the argument, did not interrupt, let it reach its natural conclusion, and then said something that made the girl's expression shift from certainty to attention. The girl looked at the figure again. She erased it. She did something different. The woman watched without triumph. She made a small mark in her notebook. She did not know she was being watched. There was no audience for whom to perform patience. She was simply patient, in the way that things are that have decided to be, and the two girls were simply learning, in the way that things learn when someone sits with them, long enough to let the shape of understanding emerge rather than insisting on its arrival. Edmund stood at the corridor window for longer than was necessary. "She has been with you some weeks," he said. "Since February," Mr. Fenn said. He did not say anything else for a moment. Then he said, "She is the finest teacher my daughters have had, and she had no reason to be kind here. None at all." Edmund looked at the courtyard one more moment. Then he turned from the window. "I am obliged to you, Mr. Fenn. I will call again before I leave the county." He said he did not explain what he had needed to see. He did not need to. The news came to Vivienne on a Wednesday in the first week of April. It came in a letter that had been sent not to her directly, but to Mr. Pear. Fenn, on the Dowager's solicitor's paper, informing the local justice of the peace that the Dowager Duchess of Aldermoor had assembled the household staff of Aldermoor Hall to receive her statement regarding the ecclesiastical petition then before the court. The letter noted that the woman formerly presenting herself as the Duchess had been found to have no valid claim to the title. It noted that the proper heir to the Aldermoor dower would be decided by the court in the forthcoming session. And it included in the most composed and deliberate phrasing the sentence that landed in Vivienne's chest like something cold and very specific. She was never truly his Duchess, and those who served the late Duke faithfully will understand this and act accordingly. Mr. Fenn showed her the letter because he believed she had a right to know. He stood near the door while she read it, not watching her face. Giving her the courtesy of privacy within proximity, she read the sentence 3 times. She folded the letter. She gave it back to Mr. Ba. Fenn said, "Thank you for telling me." She returned to the schoolroom because Patience had her arithmetic to finish, and Cecily had a natural philosophy question she had posed the previous day that deserved a real answer. She taught the rest of the morning. She marked the work at noon. She ate something. She could not afterward have said what. And in the evening she sat on the edge of the bed in her room at the Hawthorne Inn and held her cloak and felt the small hard circle of the seal ring through the lining with her thumb, and told herself quietly that she knew what she knew. She had been his wife. She had sat beside him while he died. She had held his hand. She had been for 14 months loved by a good man who had looked at her the way her own father had always said a husband should look at a wife, as though she were a specific and irreplaceable human being and not a category to be filled. No petition changed that. No ecclesiastical court changed that. No dowager changed that. She slept. If she was not entirely certain of that when she woke, the certainty returned during the morning lesson, as it had a habit of doing. The girls were kind without knowing they were being kind, which is the best kind of kind there is. It was on the morning of the 9th of April that the sound of an unusual carriage came into the yard of the Hawthorne Inn. Vivienne heard it from the schoolroom across the courtyard. She had learned over the weeks to distinguish the sounds of traffic below. The mail coach, the wool drays, the occasional private curricle of a neighboring family. This sound was different. It was the sound of a vehicle of considerable weight, drawing smoothly, with horses that were better than anything the north of this county generally produced, and with postilions whose shouts carried the particular clipped authority of men who are accustomed to being obeyed. She did not go to the window. She completed the lesson. It was Mr. Fur. Brockett, who came to the schoolroom door 10 minutes later, wearing his good coat and an expression of considerable agitation, to say that a gentleman from London had arrived and was asking for her by name, by her full name and title, and that there was also a letter, and also, he added, as though this required separate mention, a carriage in the yard with the royal arms on the door. Vivienne set down her pencil. She looked at the page she had been marking. She said to Patience and Cecily, We will continue this afternoon." She said it in the same voice she always used, which was the voice of a woman who had decided not to be disordered by circumstances, and both girls looked at her with the focused attention of children who understand that something unusual is happening, and that the woman in front of them is whatever it is, not afraid of it. She went down. Edmund Ravensley was standing in the inn's front parlor, which was somewhat overwhelmed by him, not by his size but by his composure, which took up more space than most men's movement did. He was dressed simply for a man of his station, which was still considerably more formal than anything Fenwick Cross was accustomed to, and he had the particular quality of stillness she had noticed through the corridor window 3 weeks earlier, and not yet had occasion to connect to a name. She connected it. Now he bowed. "Your Grace." Vivian looked at him for a moment. "You were at Mr. Fenn's window," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Something more, like recognition recognized. "I was." "I saw your reflection," she said, "in the glass of the cabinet behind the girl's table." "You were there some time?" "I was," he said again. She looked at him steadily. She was not going to pretend to be smaller than she was, because he was from London, and he worked for the Crown, and he was, she already understood, here on her behalf. Gratitude did not require diminishment. "You have something for me," she said. He reached into his coat and produced a sealed document. The seal was not his own. She knew that seal. Every person in England knew that seal. She took it. She broke it. She read it. "If you are reading this, you are receiving the stories that deserve to be told. If this one is already settling in your chest, stay a little longer. There is one more step to take." She read the royal letter twice and then looked up at him, and he was watching her with the expression of a man who has done something correctly after a long period of doing something wrong, and who has not yet decided what to do with the unfamiliar feeling. "The King's Own Carriage," she said. "His Majesty was very clear," Edmund said, "that the means of your return should leave no ambiguity as to his position." She looked down at the document again. The marriage register found in the county ecclesiastical office was annexed. The King's letters of patent reconfirming the Aldermore title, and all attendant properties were annexed. There was a note in the King's own hand, brief and unornamented, stating that the Duchess of Aldermore was to be restored to her home and her title with the full sanction of the Crown, and that any further petition against her was hereby dismissed. "You've found the register," she said. "It was moved," he said, "not destroyed. I found it in January. It took until March to assemble everything else the court required to dismiss the petition. You have been doing this since January." "I knew Charles," Edmund said, and something changed in his voice at the name, a particular quality of care. "He was my friend, and he would have found it entirely intolerable that someone was using a county registry office to conduct this particular species of dishonesty." She folded the document and placed it in her pocket, which was perhaps not the manner in which a duchess usually treated a royal letter, but she was not about to stand in a public inn parlor holding it in front of her like a theater prop. She said, "When do we leave?" "When you are ready," he said. She was ready within 2 hours. She settled her account with Mr. Brockett, who had gone through 3 distinct emotional states during those 2 hours, from astonished to proprietary to finally simply warmly pleased, as though some private sense of justice had been satisfied in his yard. She said goodbye to Patience and Cecily in the schoolroom. Patience cried briefly, and was embarrassed about crying briefly. Cecily shook her hand with great solemnity, and presented her with a sheet of natural philosophy that she had completed without prompting as a parting gift. Vivian took the sheet and pressed it flat in the small book she was carrying, and put the book in the trunk she packed in 40 minutes, with the ease of a woman who had been packing and unpacking her own things since January. She descended the stairs. She crossed the yard. Edmund was standing by the carriage door, and he handed her in himself, not because there were no footmen, but because he chose to. And she noticed this, and she let herself notice it. The carriage moved north to turn, and then south, and through the window of the King's Own Carriage, Vivian watched Fenwick Cross fall away behind them, and the road opened ahead in the particular quality of April light that is not yet warmth, but carries the memory of warmth. Green coming up at the verges, and the season turning. They stopped for the night at Marham, at an inn that was considerably better than the Hawthorn in every respect. And at supper Edmund told her what the court had found and what had been said and who had spoken, in the quiet, level manner of a man who communicates information as a form of respect, without either softening it or hardening it. And she listened with the attention she gave to things that mattered. He told her that Agnes had been asked by the Dowager's solicitor to testify and had declined, stating that she had nothing to say, that the documents did not already say more clearly. "Agnes," Vivian said. "She has been keeping your rooms," Edmund said. Vivian looked at the candle between them and said nothing for a moment. "You are composing yourself," he said, in a different tone, something almost carefully gentle under the levelness. "Yes," she said. "I do that when I am moved." "I have observed that," he said, and then looked at the table, and she thought, watching his face in the candlelight, that he was composing himself somewhat also. On the second day, she asked him about his wife. She asked directly, as was her nature, and he answered directly what she had already understood was his, and he told her about Eleanor, her dark eyes and particular laugh, the fact that she had died in the early hours of a morning he had not been present for because he had chosen the Crown's business over the road home. He said this last part with the specific flatness of a man who has said a true thing so many times that he can say it without the external evidence of the grief it still produces, and she listened without interjecting, which was, she had learned. "She died 3 years ago," he said. "You carry her miniature," Vivian said. He looked at her. "I do. I do not think that needs to stop," she said. "I do not say that as an invitation or as a guarantee. I say it because it is true, and because you look like a man who has been waiting for someone to say it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the spring landscape moved past the windows at a ceremonial pace, the road south widening as they entered familiar county. "You are," he said at last, "extraordinarily clear-sighted. My father gave me languages and mathematics," she said, "and an extremely low tolerance for imprecision." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she did not attempt to interpret, except to note that it was not the expression of a man looking at a charitable project or a diplomatic obligation, and that it was directed at her with the specific quality of attention that does not require anything from its object in return, that simply exists as a thing that is true, whether or not she chooses to receive it. She received it? She let herself receive it for 3 full seconds before she turned back to the window. The gates of Aldermore Hall were visible at 2 in the afternoon of the 3rd day. The carriage did not slow. The gatekeeper opened the gates. He had been standing there for some time, Vivian suspected, because his coat was the good one, and he was not wearing his working hat. He saw the royal arms as the carriage passed, and he took off the good hat and held it to his chest, and she saw him do this, and she looked forward again. The drive was a 1/4 mile of gravel between old beeches that were budding in the particular yellow-green of April. That means the world is beginning again, whether one has made provision for it or not. The hall at the end of it was exactly as she had last seen it, in snow, except that it was now washed in the afternoon light of a late April day, and the stone was warm-colored, and a wisteria she had not yet seen in bloom was beginning along the east wall, and a woman was standing on the front steps. Agnes. Behind Agnes, the household staff were arranged in the manner of a household receiving a mistress. Not all of them looked comfortable. Several looked extremely uncomfortable, which was its own kind of testimony. Dorothea was standing to one side, slightly apart, and her expression was that of a young woman who has had several weeks to consider her own position and has arrived at a conclusion she had not started with. The Dowager Duchess Constance stood at the drawing-room window, where she had stood in January. The window was closed. Her face was unreadable from this distance. Edmund stepped down first. He handed Vivian out. She stood at the foot of the steps in the April afternoon, in a traveling dress that was not her finest, and a cloak she had worn every day for 3 months, and she looked up at the face of Aldermore Hall and at the woman on the top step, Agnes, who was not crying because she was too old and had too much dignity to cry. but whose face was doing something difficult to look at directly. There was a murmur through the household staff. The housekeeper moved first because, of course, she did, beginning the particular motion that was the whole-body acknowledgement of a mistress returned, and the other staff followed, and there was a moment of held stillness in the yard before it broke. Lady Dorothea Merritt stepped forward. Vivian looked at her. Dorothea's face was composed, but she had plainly been doing careful thinking, and the thinking had brought her somewhere. "Your Grace," Dorothea said clearly, without qualification. "Lady Dorothea," Vivian said, and let the warmth she actually felt for this somewhat bewildered young woman enter her voice, because she was not in the business of punishing people for being positioned against their will. She climbed the steps at the top. Agnes was waiting, and Vivian took both the older woman's hands in hers and held them, and Agnes said nothing because nothing was required, and Vivian asked, "Is my room as it was?" "Exactly as it was," Agnes said, and could not quite finish the sentence. It was Constance who appeared in the doorway at that moment, having apparently determined that remaining at the window was not tenable. She stood very straight. She had always stood very straight. Her hands were folded exactly as they had been folded in January. But something in the symmetry of the gesture was different, and it took Vivian a moment to understand that the difference was that in January, Constance had been folding her hands with confidence, and now she was folding them with resolve, which is what confidence looks like when it has recently been corrected. She looked at the carriage. She looked at the arms on the door. She looked at Edmund, who stood at the foot of the steps below them, with the contained quietness of a man who does not need to speak to be legible. "Your Grace," she said. And she said it to Vivian, with the full weight of the title, each syllable placed with the care of a woman who has lived her entire life, knowing that words in this register are not ornamental, that they carry the thing they name. Edmund spoke for the first time since they had entered the gates. His voice was level as it always was, and it carried in the April air without effort. "She is the Duchess of Aldermoor," he said. "She has always been." 9 words. He had said 12 would be the limit, and he had managed 9, which was characteristic. The yard was quiet. A bee moved through the wisteria at the east wall. Somewhere a horse shifted in the stable block. Constance looked at Edmund and then at Vivian, and then at the document case still visible inside the open carriage door. And something behind her eyes completed a journey it had been making, Vivian suspected for some weeks. She was not humiliated. She was corrected, in front of her household, by the authority she had always acknowledged as superior to her own, and she was being offered the option of receiving that correction with grace, and she was taking it because she was, under all of it, a woman who had her own sense of the proper order of things. And the proper order of things included the management of one's own defeat. She inclined her head. It was not a bow. It was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement, which was what the moment required, and it was given with the same care she had given to everything in her life. And Vivian received it without triumph, because there was no triumph to be had from watching a woman of 70 years recognize that she had been wrong about the things she most wanted to be right about. The household filed inside. Dorothea fell into step beside Vivian, and she said very quietly, "I tried to say something in February." No one listened. Vivian looked at her. "I know," she said. "Come to tea tomorrow. We will talk properly." The rooms were as Agnes had promised. Every piece of furniture was in its place. The fire was already lit, because Agnes had lit it an hour before the carriage arrived, because of course she had. On the mantelpiece, where Vivian had placed it on the morning of her wedding day, was the small painted card Charles had written to her that morning. The one she had thought was gone, with everything else. And she had thought it was gone because she had not thought to check, because she had not thought anyone would notice. Who had noticed everything for 30 years had put a book over it when the footmen were clearing the room in January, and had moved the book and left the card exactly where Vivian had placed it. She stood at the mantelpiece and looked at it without picking it up. She heard Edmund in the corridor, speaking briefly with one of the footmen about the carriage horses. She heard the footman's reply. She heard Edmund's boot on the floor stopping just outside the open door. She picked up the late Duke's card and read it, though she already knew every word. She returned it to the mantelpiece. She reached into her cloak. She worked open the lining seam. She had stitched herself in January, in a cold room by a guttering candle. She withdrew the seal ring. It was exactly as Charles had given it to her, heavy and silver, the Aldermore device worn at the edges in the manner of a thing that has been used and carried, and turned in hands across many years. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling its weight. She placed it on her finger. Behind her from the doorway, Edmund said nothing for a count of 3, which was how she knew he was not unmoved. "You had it the whole time," he said. "He gave it to me," she said, "on the morning of the wedding. He put it in my hand and said I was to carry it with the understanding that this was his seal." "He knew," Edmund said. She looked at the ring on her hand. "He knew her very well," she said. He had spent 60 years learning how she operated. She said this without bitterness, which was, she thought, not yet what she felt, but it was what she would feel in a year, and one could practice ahead of the feeling. She turned to face him. "He also knew that I was capable of waiting it out. He said that to me once, in the way he said things, as though he were observing a fact rather than offering comfort. He said, in the way he said things, that she was the sort of woman who outlasts things." Edmund was standing in the doorway with the afternoon light behind him, and he was looking at her with the expression she had noticed in the carriage and had chosen. Then, not to fully receive, she received it now. "Lord Ravensleigh," she said. "Edmund," he said. He said it in the deliberate way of a man making a small, irrevocable choice. She looked at him. "Edmund," she said. "Thank you. I was too late once," he said, "for something that could not be recovered. I did not wish to be too late again." He crossed the room in 2 strides, not 3, and stopped at a proper distance, which was slightly less proper than it would have been in London. And he held out his hand, not a formal offer of escort, not a command, something between the two. An invitation shaped like a question, made by a hand that had spent 3 months assembling evidence on behalf of a woman he had not yet met, and which was now extended toward her in a room full of April light. She put her hand in his. The spring evening was warm as evenings in April, very occasionally are, as though they have decided briefly to practice being summer. Through the window of Vivian's sitting room, the beeches along the drive caught the last light, and the wisteria against the east wall was fully open now, heavy with purple, scenting the air that came through the window she had opened. On the mantelpiece beside Charles's card was Edmund's miniature of Eleanor. Vivian had put it there herself this afternoon, having taken it from his coat pocket, with his permission and his careful, complicated attention, on her face as she did. They were 2 people who had each loved someone and lost them, and who were with the particular care of people who have learned that love is not a convention, but a costly, specific act, beginning something. Agnes brought tea at 5, and looked at the miniature on the mantelpiece, and looked at Vivian, and looked at Edmund, and said nothing, which was Agnes saying a great deal. Vivian poured. Edmund accepted his cup, and sat across from her in the chair by the window, the one with the south-facing light, and the ring was on her finger, and the card was on the mantelpiece, and the evening was coming in soft and warm off the green of the grounds. Somewhere below, a blackbird was singing with the absolute conviction of a creature that has no doubt that the season has turned and means to go on turning. She had been cast into the snow. She had returned in spring. It was enough for now to sit in this room, in this light, and know exactly where she was. If this story sat with you, leave a note below. She waited 3 months to come home. Thank you for staying until she arrived.